A growing number of educators are not declaring their criminal convictions. And this is according to TPN Credit Bureau, and their data reveals that 3.6% of teachers have a criminal record and that more than 2/3 actually don't declare that they've had previous convictions. In 2019, a new policy was introduced that all new teachers registering with the South African Council of Educators, or SACE, must obtain and submit police clearance certificates when they register with the Professional Council for Educators. Schools are also legally required to do background checks on, and also all prospective educators should be subjected to that. So for more on this, we're joined by Waldo Marcus from TPN Credit Bureau to have a further discussion about these very interesting findings. Waldo, good morning. Thanks for being with us here on Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and good morning to your viewers. Thanks for having me.
So what does your research actually reveal if we break it down? Is South Africa, through the education department at large via SACE, are they slacking in terms of vetting educators, or what is actually happening here?
Well, we look at both the private and the government sector, public school sector. And the start of the SACE new policy in 2019, we've definitely seen a ramp up of those teachers that's come through for screening. What we're also seeing is that from last year to this year, there's been a massive jump, especially within the private school and those public fee-paying schools, that is approaching the Bureau to do full background checks on the entire staff complement. So since the start in 2019, we have definitely seen an improvement of those requirements being met by the educators, but we still have a far way to go.
So, Waldo, when we talk about, the vetting of teachers, does this apply only to new entrants into the profession, or is it retrospective such that every educator in the system ought to be vetted?
Based on the regulations, it's every educator that is currently in the system, and it's not just teachers. It also includes coaches, administrative staff, and people working with disabled people. Anyone that falls within the ambit of the Child Protection Act as well as the Schools Act will need to go through these checks on a regular basis. It is advised to do every second year to check your entire staff complement, as new convictions can be added, which might have not appeared a couple of years ago.
So to that point, and then in the introduction, as stated there, the onus is also on the schools and those responsible for running the individual schools for also making sure that the educators at their school are vetted. But where should the focus be? Vetting by the education department, or declarations by educators being employed or those already in the system? And is there a loophole there that's currently being exploited?
No, I don't think there's necessarily a loophole being exploited. Of course, there is a financial strain on schools across the board to do these checks. It is within the public sphere. It is the Department of Education that's responsible for the cost. Within the private school sector, it is the responsibility of those organizations to fund these. And as you can imagine, some schools are sitting with 150 staff members that need to be checked every second year. So making provision within those budgets becomes critical. The ultimate responsibility resides with the principal. The principal needs to ensure that they follow all procedures and that everyone has been checked. In some cases, the school governing body will also be responsible. But the acts and the regulations make provision that anyone within the community that has reasonable suspicion should raise it with the school principal and understand what is the policies on handling these types of convictions, being it declared or not declared, prior to the check taking place.
So if a conviction is uncovered during the check, what does the Act say?
Well, there is certain convictions that will result in immediate dismissal. Those are usually of the extreme and nature. That will include sexual abuse, child neglect. There's other convictions that is excluded, and therefore that should it be disclosed, prior to the check taking place, the teacher would not necessarily be dismissed, and each school will then have certain policies and procedures to deal with those convictions. After 10 years, some convictions can be applied for to be expunged and removed from the record, but more detail around that sits within SACE, and each school will have a policy to understand and manage these type of situations.
I'm just wondering about the onus being placed on the teacher. Should teachers not be expected, as a rule, to actually disclose? Because that would make things easier, wouldn't it?
Exactly, and that's what the new regulations in January 2019 prescribes, is that teachers need to disclose any conviction that the school or the entity in which they function can make the necessary changes. But as you said, 2/3 have not disclosed their convictions prior to entering it. So it's a dual responsibility, and we actually look at the ecosystem and the stakeholders as a whole. Teachers must disclose their convictions prior to it being screened, but it's also the responsibility within the communities they function, various stakeholders, to say if there's reasonable suspicion, and I must say whistleblowers are protected by the Act, to say there is reasonable suspicion, raise it. But ultimately, it would be great to see teachers coming forward and say, listen, I have this conviction, and let's deal with it on a case-by-case basis.
And I would go further to say it shouldn't be, it would be good or nice for them to do that. It should be as a rule. And if you don't, I think there should be sanctions, because that would just really facilitate this process in a huge way. But coming back to your survey and looking at the statistics that and what it reveals, what kind of crimes are being committed in the main or have come up during the vetting processes?
So the top 5 convictions, and these are people that's been convicted prior to 2019 or recently. We find the top one being theft. That's about 25% of those were convicted of theft. Second is the traffic offences, and that can include reckless driving. We move over to assault and fraud. And then the one that we've highlighted in our report is those convictions that relate to serious crimes, including sexual abuse, neglect of children. And that sits on 2.61% of all those being convicted fall within that category. Robbery is number 6. So there's some serious convictions that sit under that list in the top 5. And if you look at the convictions further down the line, it includes everything up to murder.
Now, that's very serious, because if you look at the convictions related to abuse and crimes of a sexual nature, making up 2.63% of those convictions, as your survey portrays, those are people who should not be in the schooling system.
Absolutely correct. They should not be, and based on the regulations, they should come forward, and the school is notified of this crime. Immediate dismissal will take place.
So, Waldo, let me understand. So, through the research that you did, do you actually have names of those teachers with these particular convictions, or is this just, broad strokes without necessarily revealing any quantitative data and drilling down to the actual details of those involved?
The checks performed by TPN includes 3 checks. It's a biometrics fingerprint check, which is compliant with SACE. Then we also do the Child Protection Register and the National Register of Sexual Offences, which is physical fingerprints, which is then submitted to the various departments, which then run the screening. Our data, because we that type of information that we do collect, we provide that back to a specific individual within the school, and it includes all details within that relevant party, so that they may act and have the relevant proof to take them through the required disciplinary process or dismissal process if needed.
And I'm curious to know, are you going to follow up on that? Because it's going to be interesting to see what the schools actually do with that information.
Yes, so we work very closely with the Registrar of the National Register of Sexual Offences, and we've maintained good communications with the registrar specifically to follow up. We do provide this as a service nationally, and we send that information through to the schools. Every 2 years, we then, of course, rerun those checks specifically for those schools. And I'm confident that in the next run that we do next year, we'll start seeing those that is not disclosing their convictions are going to come down.
Another one that disturbed me here, Waldo, was the drug trafficking. It was 4% of teachers convicted for drug trafficking.
It is very high, and I just need to clarify, these are convictions that could have been done prior to 2019 where the regulations come in. So this could have happened 5, 6, 7 years ago when this conviction took place. But yes, it's a worrying trend. And if you look at the crime statistics in South Africa, it is starting to show that it's not just within certain sectors, but it's moving into the education sector where we see some of these previously convicted individuals finding positions within this education sector.
And I think what was also interesting is that more than 40% of those who were found guilty were between the ages of 18 and 25, and 38% between the ages of 26 and 40.
Yes, it's interesting. We break it up in ages. Anything above 18, we're allowed to disclose, where they were convicted after the age of 18, and it runs all the way to 64-year-old, where the last conviction was one of the eldest individuals that was convicted was at the age of 64. So it's a real spread, but we definitely see it that in the younger age groups that convictions are more prominent.
So just a final question, Waldo. How do we remedy this situation? And, how do we do better as a society holistically from this particular point?
Well, for us, it is ensure that the necessary checks are conducted. If you are a parent, you have the right to go to your school and understand as what is their policies. Have they performed these checks? You might not necessarily ask what the outcome is of those necessarily the individuals that's been checked, but you can make sure that those that is educating children or working with vulnerable people have undergone the necessary checks, and that they do have the necessary regulations and policies in place to ensure the safety of the children as well as those that's vulnerable. It does extend to a degree to those working within hospitals where they do care for children as well. So it is not just within education. We focus on education, but it does go slightly beyond just education at this stage.
Well, Waldo, we'll leave it there, but thank you so much for speaking to us. Very enlightening there. And as you know, schools are now legally required to do background checks on prospective educators. And Waldo just breaking down for us what their survey found. And Waldo Marcus is from TPN Credit Bureau.